I will sort of perhaps just say a little bit about my own early history, because I think compared with some people on this call, I probably came rather late to David's work. And unlike the sort of sociological formation that Christian's just been describing at Manchester, I mean, I studied social and political science at Cambridge, 68 to 71, which makes me just a little bit older than Christian. And organisation simply didn't feature. I mean, there was no paper on them in the finals, no elective. Nobody really talked about it very much. There was a time in my life when I was intimately familiar with all the nuances of Frankfurt Marxism and the writings of Antonio Gramsci and Georgi Lukács, which was effectively defined sociology at Cambridge, with sort of odd bits thrown in, like Tony Giddens was did a very bog standard classical theory course. Ray Jobling, who's not particularly well known, but did a really interesting sociology of knowledge course. But there wasn't really, I mean, even deviance didn't get the fashion for deviance of the late 60s didn't get much of a look in. I mean, the Institute of Criminology sort of mentioned it in a couple of lectures with utterly exquisite distaste. But it all sort of passed really under the radar until I ended up as a PhD student in Aberdeen, partly because nobody ever wanted to be a PhD student in Aberdeen. They had these sort of really valuable MRC studentships to give away, which had much better pay and conditions than ESRC studentships. But I came from a railway family, so I got free travel on the trains. So I was really not at all bothered by the thought of going to Aberdeen and feeling that I might be stuck there. So I landed up at this sort of wonderful place full of very exciting people to write a PhD, which was originally going to be a sort of professional socialization study of some kind, a bit of a sort of rerun of Boys in White or something like that. Although I was more influenced by a less well-known study by Virginia Olson, L.V. Whitaker, The Silent Dialogue, which was actually a study of nurses, and which was actually much more of a transition between classic Chicago school and the sort of influences from Schutz, from phenomenology, to a lesser extent from ethnomethodology, that began to come into UCSF during the 1960s. And it's not, I think, well recognized the extent to which Anselm Strauss and his group had an interest in Garfinkel's work. And it's sort of not there in the 1950s work, but it's there in the 60s work. And I suppose it was important in the sort of thinking that I did that redefined professional socialization from the sort of social psychology to the organizational production of competence. And to see that the students on the health visiting course that I ended up studying were people who were going through an organization, and they were learning the organizational skills of their trade. And the health visitor program itself was organizationally producing the competence of the students. So that the challenge was, how does this organization come to recognize that it has produced competent graduates? And that, so the study of assessment, for example, is much more central than you would find in the earlier studies, the earlier Chicago socialization studies. So I only encountered David's work as a graduate student in the, somewhat later than Christian. in a context where I was sort of learning very rapidly all this weird stuff that people like Phil Strong and Alan Davis were excited by, in terms of, here's interactionism, here, Aberdeen was one of the first places, along with Manchester, to be looking at ethnomethodology seriously, and to see David's work as a sort of obituary, that theory of organizations was, as Christian has very eloquently put it, this kind of monumental critical literature review that was really celebrating the dead end of a tradition and pointing in a new direction. And I think the critique is important. It's a wonderful resource, was a wonderful resource for a PhD student, because it basically said there's all this stuff that's gone before and you don't need to bother reading any of it, because I've read it all for you and I've told you what's wrong with it. It's perhaps a bit less clear about what you actually do once you've done that. And I think that, as Christian says, there was still, I think, this puzzle for many of us at that point, that we knew what we didn't want to do, but we weren't into, and we knew what we shouldn't be doing, but it wasn't entirely clear sort of where we went with that. And, I very much recognize, Christian's sort of struggles account of his struggles in 1974 about, here I've got this research site and what the hell do I do now? I think that, I never had quite the sort of conversation that he describes with Howard Becker with Phil Strong, but I think I had a few that amounted to more or less the same thing. And I sort of saw theory of organizations, if you like, as a bridge, that was perhaps not quite fully built across the river. There was a span missing at the very end, that you kind of got to a certain point, and then kind of where did you go next? And I think it's interesting to speculate, looking back, as to the difference that it might have made if David had spent a year at UCSF rather than at UCLA. And what sort, what are the sort of counterfactuals? What would org studies have looked like if there'd been a stronger cross-fertilization between the Strauss group and David's thinking, rather than with UCLA? I don't read a lot of org studies these days, but I'm very aware of the sort of frequent, whatever happened to the Strauss school, whatever happened to the interactionist thinking about organizations. And I still keep in touch with some interactionist networks who, scratch their head considerably about that. And, did it just sort of become a diffuse influence, or did it just sort of pass out of fashion? Did it, why didn't the new institutionalist movement not take it up in the way that it might have done? Why did DiMaggio and Powell turn to Weber rather than turning to Strauss and Goffman in the way that, in a way that would obviously have been available to them? And it's arguable that a different, that theory of organizations might have taken the field in a quite different direction with a different sequel. As it was, the sequel, and David may not care to be reminded of this, but I actually thought, reading Castaneda, it's still on my shelf. And I actually still think it's one of the most accessible introductions to ethnomethodology that anybody's written. But of course, it's kind of caught up in all the scandals around Castaneda's PhD and Castaneda's fieldwork. And as David says in the book, it doesn't really matter whether Castaneda made up all his data or not. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, Castaneda was a UCLA anthropology student. Garfinkel was on his dissertation committee. And Castaneda produced this enormously influential book called The Teachings of Don Juan, which was about hanging out with I suppose, some kind of traditional priest, shaman, healer in the Mexican desert, and taking an awful lot of drugs in the process. A huge consumption of magic mushrooms and various other things. And I think it's now fairly widely accepted that most of his PhD was made up because he was too off his head most of the time to collect any data. And the dissertation committee sort of failed to note this at the time, with the possible exception of Harold, who didn't really care, because for him, in a sense, what it was, even if Castaneda had made up his data, he'd made up the data that showed what it took to practice as a shaman, and that in terms of the ethnomethodological studies of work program, here was a neat example of it, to set alongside the other assignments that Garfinkel was giving graduate students at the time. Go off and study law, go off and study math, become one of these people and write about what it takes to be it. And that this is the key. And so what we have is, this is something that does very much sort of take the thinking of theory of organizations forward into the study of practices, and to see if you like, to sort of move beyond the Chicago tradition of just hanging out, to get into the just whatness of the work, that sort of describing the scenes, setting the scenes, this sort of redescription was not what it was about. It was about recovering the accomplishment in the way that Christian was demonstrating in the video clips that he's just shown us. I think that, the other legacy of UCLA, of course, which comes a bit later, is also this, which is the Harvey Sachs book, which again, it's still very, it's a very accessible introduction to conversation analysis. But I think it's kind of I find it very interesting, and I'd be interested with Christian's thoughts on this. But if you hang out around the CA world, the way in which David's work is strictly non-canonical, you very rarely see it sort of brought in, and I find that a little disappointing, because I think David, you must have been acquainted with Harvey Sachs at the time. That certainly the book captures the spirit of the lectures rather better than an awful lot of the technical work that's followed since. That what David is doing is explaining why conversation analysis is sociology. And I don't think Harvey ever doubted that. If you read the lectures, he would, I think, not have encouraged this idea of conversation analysis as somehow some discrete area of activity, something that was sort of in the States now is increasingly drifting off into communications, and moving away from those kinds of roots in that this was a sociology. It was a way of that it establishes Sachs as a much broader thinker and reader, and again comes back to this idea of what is being done through talk, rather than a focus on the accomplishment of the talk itself. And there, I think again we see this issue of what do you do with theory of organizations being filled in. That, on the one hand you have the study of practices, on the other hand you have the study of talk, but these are not, for David, self-sufficient in themselves in the way that they might be for somebody who was more of a purist in either ethnomethodology or in conversation analysis. They are a means to an end. So I think what we see as this sort of evolving legacy is the search for rigor in theory and method, which we've already touched on this morning, and I won't, or I see that Stuart's just gone to bed, but wherever we are on the planet and whatever time zone we're in, and I don't think I need to add more to that. But I think it is this issue of, also raise the issues of the place of the study of organizations as a topic within sociology, which again we've touched on several times, and which I actually had in the notes I'd prepared beforehand. And one of the problems that we encounter at the moment, I think, is the way in which org studies has drifted off into the business school for quite understandable institutional and market reasons, but in doing so has lost some of the things that David identified in theory of organizations as important, and it's lost that kind of anchorage in the great 2,000-year tradition of social science, which for me very much permeates David's approach. I think that people are sort of grumbling in the chat about speakers talking too long, so I think I'll stop at this point.